Good evening, everyone. Apropos, the title of this talk is Ending Global Sprawl, and Tom is stuck in traffic. So my name is Julie Kim. I know most of you in the room. For those of you whom I've not met, I'm the school chair here in the School of Architecture, and we're really pleased to have you here with us tonight, actually in the room as well as online. I think we have close to 100 people that are online Zooming in, so that's terrific. Well, at the end, we'll introduce Tom, but I want to just thank TSW for their generous support that allows us to offer this great lecture series. And we've had a number of lectures over the last 4 or 5 years, or 4 years?
This is the fourth.
4 years.
Yeah.
That we've just been able to bring in some really compelling speakers that are addressing pressing issues of the day. So I'm really pleased about that. And I want to thank Ellen Dunham-Jones for all of her help in continuing to oversee this lecture series and finding those people who are parts of these conversations and bringing it to all of us, faculty, students, and then professionals in the community. So I'm happy to see there are a number of students in the audience as well tonight. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ellen.
All right. Thank you, Julie. And couldn't be more delighted to have Peter Calthorpe joining us.
All right. So I thought, I don't do a lot that's new. As a matter of fact, everything is very old in my world. And as a matter of fact, I thought I'd start today by reminiscing a little bit about how I got started in all this and how frighteningly consistent and maybe boring the continuity and consistency of it all is. I'm going to start there, and then I'm going to talk about this book for the World Bank, which I think is a pretty important step for them, and it's a nice way of gathering together a lot of decades of experience and thinking about urbanism at a global scale, not just in terms of our particular circumstance in the United States. But then I wanted to also focus in on the United States with our thinking about housing, workforce housing, the future of cities. I'm watching my beloved city and Bay Area implode on many levels these days. On the surface, people think it has to do with COVID and people not going to work. But in a much deeper reality, it's no longer a diverse place that creates opportunities for everybody who needs and wants to live here for them to find a place. And so all these things kind of crash together. And for me now, it's a lot realer than it used to be. So I will ramble if I don't go to my slides because they're the only way that I can organize my thoughts. So let me do the share at this point. Okay. So a bit of a retrospective.
Peter, still we're seeing your whole layout, not your individual slide. Go to slides to screen, fill the screen. There we go.
Yeah,
we got it.
Yeah, Ellen, I really do know how to run PowerPoint.
Okay, it wasn't showing up.
But I'm slower, with time, a victim. So I have written a lot over the years, and I've done a lot of different kinds of projects from small scale to large scale, from regional to global policy. And I've been thinking lately about the points of continuity. And, continuity has to do with history. These are some of the books, and maybe they seem random, but I think actually the principles that I'll end with today really put all the pieces together. But I did want to go back to the beginning. Sustainable Communities was a book that I did with Sim Vander in the 70s. The work was done in the 70s, and it was the early 80s that we published the book. And we came together in Sacramento in a golden age when Jerry Brown was first governor and he was dating a rock star, and the whole idea of urbanism and the environment was coming to the foreground, at least in his mind and in our world. It was a utopian period, but with the kind of power that you got with the governor being interested and him creating a salon of, I think, some of the most brilliant people on the planet at the time, people like Buckminster Fuller and Avery Lovins and E.F. Schumacher and Gregory Bateson. Great minds would come together and actually think about the challenges we had at a large scale. Sim and I got to work on the physical, the built environment, the urban environment. And of course, at the core of it was the capital area. It's a district within a city. It's self-governing by the state, not by, it's a little bit like Washington, D.C., but just a few 10 city blocks. This, before Jerry Brown, was Ronald Reagan. The footnote to all this, of course, is that most urbanism and urban design is very political. And if there isn't a political patron, actually it's hard, who represents the people's concerns on some level, it's hard to do anything of consequence. Anyway, this is Ronald Reagan, who wanted to do a Towers in the Park redevelopment of the downtown capital area. You'll see this huge super block in the foreground, right behind the Capitol building itself and the Capitol Park. And it involved demolishing all the mixed use, the messy housing that used to be there, and taking out the simple 300-foot city grid. It was basically everything we thought was wrong. Here's a rough model of what they wanted to do. And it's a paradigm of stuff that happened tragically after World War II in many developing countries. And of course, was the signature of our public housing policy. This was our plan, which was to preserve the historic fine-grained grid and the fine grain of the mixed use. There's a lot of blue in there for state office buildings, but Jerry wanted us to also demonstrate that we could build state office buildings that were energy efficient in a way that nobody had even conceived of. So part of our assignment was an urban design, which had to do with preservation and infill, and also demonstration to show best practice in terms of how buildings fit into the urban landscape, but also respond to the physical environment. And we loved having that challenge. We brought the idea of streetscape back into the equation. It was a low-rise, high-density, mixed-use formula. John Cricken of SOM worked on the plan with us, and it was quite exciting. And in it are the roots of basically all the urbanism I've ever done since. We were also assigned a task to do a 250,000 square foot office building that would demonstrate that we could cut energy consumption by 80% by using natural forces of climate and place. And this is the result of that amazing collaboration. It's a building in which each facade responds to its solar orientation. It's a classic courtyard building that surrounds, that has passive solar heating and cooling, natural ventilation, and natural light. Now, in the 70s, these things were not as normative as they've become in the midst of LEED. And I must say that architects are beginning to make really great strides in terms of this, the imperative to have buildings be efficient and really of their place. We had to experiment with the idea of natural light, natural ventilation. And this is an interesting shot because behind it, of course, is the Ronald Reagan famous buildings OB 8 and 9, very romantically named. Our building was named after Gregory Bateson, the great anthropologist and philosopher. This courtyard had active louvers so that in the summer it was shaded, in the winter it was heated, passively heated. The whole building was made out of exposed concrete so that it could absorb cool night air, like most dry climate areas like Sacramento used to do. The stairs were a big feature because we thought that was healthy as opposed to elevators. There are elevators hidden somewhere in there. And these big tubes were meant to de-stratify the heat. So it was all about making a building active, engage the physical environment and the street. there's a plethora of strategies here, and we did succeed. And then we wrote a law, Title 24, which set energy standards for the state of California, which is one of the prime reasons the state actually consumes less energy per capita than any other in the country. And so 50 years later, these kinds of impacts have real consequence. Now, the most interesting part of the Bateson building isn't all these natural ventilation courtyard strategies. Very few people would ever even guess what the biggest, most profound energy conservation urban strategy is. So I'll just tell you, there's zero parking, 250,000 square feet of people working with no place to bring their car. I remember sitting in meetings where we said, well, are we going to build a parking structure? Where is it going to go? And Jerry just said, no, just don't build it. People will figure it out. And that's what happened. And now, of course, we're still focused on that issue, that parking is an attractor that really decimates the environment and enhances our capacity to misbehave, i.e. get stuck in traffic. This is another project a block away. You know, I was a struggling architect at the time. After this, I did give up architecture because I realized I wasn't good at it. But this is more than architecture. This is a city block with maybe 50 units per acre, but it's a mixed income project. It was one of the first times people started to experiment with that idea. So we passed a law, AB 333, which provided state subsidies to developers who would build projects that were 1/3 market rate, 1/3 of median income, and 1/3 affordable, which is what this is. This is also 100% passive solar. You'll notice everything facing south here, complete with collectors over the roof there. And also mixed households. So some apartments and some townhouses, some families, some singles. You know, this idea that it's always one size fits all, even within a project, was a departure. And as I said, I'm not going to look for any architecture awards here. But once again, it changed the nature of the building in substantial ways, which was we used plaster instead of sheetrocks on the interiors for the same reason we exposed the concrete in the Bateson building, which was to absorb cool night air and flywheel the temperature through the next day, and then in the winter to absorb solar heat. Pretty crude shading, but it works, and orientation. And so this is the energy imperative and the urban imperative at the same time. Kind of fits the context and didn't have big enough sidewalks, I will admit at this point, but vertical mixed use as well. So we got to play around with everything that is kind of at the source of things for me in those first days, and indelible and powerful. We added light rail. It brought downtown back to life in ways that tragically these things don't seem to be happening anymore, and we can't make happen. We even went as far as to say the energy source should be biomass rather than oil. And there was a huge beetle infestation in the Sierras, which were producing a lot of dead trees. We turned those into wood chips, put them into a wood chip gasifier. And this is a crude diagram, but this thing actually got built. The gasifier allowed the chips to go into a cogeneration plant, which produced both electricity and waste heat. The waste heat was pumped around to the whole capital area and provided very, very low carbon-based energy. So even after saving energy in the buildings, we did one step further. And then, of course, SIM was a champion of whole systems design. And so the whole idea of where the waste and water recycling here into composters and aqua farms and irrigation water, a lot of these ideas were just percolating, to use a bad pun, at the time. So I actually put that in the front because I realized that actually I haven't come very far. that all those ideas are still embedded in everything we do. And it's a way of thinking about the built environment that's much more complete than even if you just think of yourself as an urbanist, because there's sociology, there's economics, and there's environmentalism all packed together. So now I'll just go into this. When I started working for the World Bank, which is not the world's most benign organization, I think most people know what it does. It lends money to developing countries at a discount rate, as long as they build Western technology and go into debt to the point where they go bankrupt as a country at some point. That's a cynical remark. There's some truth in it, however. But luckily, there were good people there who wanted us to write a set of design standards, because they approached their infrastructure investments without any awareness about the kind of urbanism the investments would create. So dams and ports and power plants and freeways were all on the agenda for what developing countries needed. And we wrote a set of urban design standards. When I began thinking about it, I realized that there were three kinds of sprawl, or three challenges on the planet, and they had similarities. In the developing world, the problem was really low-income sprawl, people moving to major metropolitan areas, not having places to live, squatting, settling, building places themselves, more often than not in remote locations that are inaccessible to the jobs that they were trying to better their lives with. In China, a whole nother variety was going on with their adoption of the super block tower in the park, but too many cases forgetting about the park, a kind of high density sprawl, which things had lost human scale and connectivity. And then, of course, our particular variety, which we've been battling as new urbanists for a long time, which is, how do you turn these places into real walkable communities that integrate different income and age groups and have, it's astounding to me that now we have a new term, I believe it's called a 15-minute city, as if that hadn't always been at the heart of what new urbanism was advocating with its neighborhood and walking scale. I'm going to go first into the issue of the three types of sprawl, R's, which I called high income sprawl, because relative to the rest of the planet, it really is only affordable in a country like ours. But the tragedy, of course, is that it's no longer affordable. I think 2008 was a watershed that proved not that that the bankers had absconded with a lot of nefarious money, but that we had built too much of the wrong kind of housing in the wrong location, and the middle class and the lower middle class and the working poor all collapsed under the weight of our housing solution and could no longer afford it. So, we see these kinds of collapses. The tragedy, of course, we don't see the right lessons in it. It's played out in California in spades, especially on the coast. And we have not only the lack of affordability in housing, but we just don't produce enough housing. And the depth, because of NIMBYs, because of all the regulations and the capacity, and quite frankly, the EIRs and the environmentalists that reinforce the notion that we want housing, you just can't do it here. This is a boring but profound slide, and it talks about this sea change I'm talking about. You'll see here is in oranges, housing units produced single family per annum. We got up close to 160,000 before 2008. And then, of course, in a 3-to-1, 4-to-1 ratio, multifamily, underbuilding the kind of housing that increasingly the workforce and the working poor need in this country, not to mention low-income households. Everybody, or at least three-quarters of everybody, should be able to afford a single-family dwelling. And of course, 2008 proved that was no longer the case. And as the production nosedived and started to rise back out. What you see here is that we're now at parity. We're at building 50% of our housing is multifamily, which is, I think, a really good thing. There's a little more balance, and perhaps it's a little more accessible, especially to those households whose incomes have been stagnant for the last 30 years. You know, it is true that the blue-collar world in the United States got left behind, and there's somebody out there picking up the pieces. Once again, another political reality that's tied to the man-made environment. I think it's time we come up with solutions for how we're going to house the working poor and the people who make our cities function, because quite frankly, here in the Bay Area, they're no longer functioning. And businesses are leaving as well as people because of the lack of affordability. This is Center for Neighborhood Technology. Scott Bernstein did these maps to prove that the collapse in 08 really was about location, that Drive to Qualify actually collapsed at that point. And we have to think of a whole new generation of housing in a whole new fashion. And not just because of expense. Look at the difference in how, and we've been pounding on this issue for decades, you know, that we're no longer married with children. We're no longer Ozzie and Harriet. We're no longer people who can afford to drive 30 miles a day each way. And, you know, a lot of people say, well, now we don't have to worry. We can just work from home. Yes, there's a white collar group of people that get to do that, people who work on from a screen, but a lot of people have to take their bodies to work every day, whether they're teaching or firemen or basically working in restaurants. I mean, doing the physical things in our communities. I'd like to see it all happen maybe virtually, and maybe that's what those glasses are going to be for at some point. But 35% of the households are single people living alone. Where do they live? This is actually statistics from the Seattle region. When you look at income tranches, you note that only about a third of the households can afford a single family, and 2/3 need something that sits at a different price point. So we now have a marketplace, and even I think most developers get it, the wherewithal to start building, catching up with what's long overdue, which is more urban dense housing. We foreshadowed this in 2010 with a study for the state of California looking at growth in different formats. Trend was typical sprawl, and compact was basically streetcar suburbs, you know, walkable neighborhoods, still cottages, townhouses, I guess what's called missing middle, not radical high-rise stuff. And these started to play out through some regional plans around the state that we did. This is just a mapping of the LA region in 2050 with standard sprawl growth versus with more compact. And so the differences are extraordinary, and we were able to actually quantify the differences in terms of land, in terms of VMT, you know, 10,000 fewer miles per count per household, excuse me. These are significant changes in our behavior and our impact and our physical needs. Emissions and climate change comes way down. And this is just in terms of passenger vehicles and buildings. It doesn't have to do with the kinds of materials and things we consume, which are a whole nother matter. But most importantly, perhaps, was that it was a more affordable way to live, compact, walkable. We've been saying this for a long time, but it's really relevant at this point. And so I began searching for a way to make this real. And so were a lot of people back in Sacramento, my old stomping grounds. SB 50 came along, which was based on our idea of transit-oriented development. It failed, and I'll tell you why. We actually did the analysis on it and discovered that it really was too blunt an instrument. to apply in a ubiquitous way. There's the missing middle idea that we could go into all the rezone all the single family neighborhoods and allow fourplexes and sixplexes, which is a very righteous, maybe self-righteous idea. The reality, of course, tragically, is that homeowners are really not contractors. They're not developers. They're not people who understand financing, and they're not people who actually want to live on a construction site. So even though we passed that law, it has produced nearly no additional housing. A fool's errand that caused a huge political backlash. So first, the TOD idea. We started this one rolling, not just in Sacramento, but of course with the Portland Metro Plan, and shifted dollars from a ring freeway to the West Side Light Rail, and conceived of a whole series of TODs along it. But the people who really did it right, and I'm going to show a recent project of ours in Vancouver, they took that idea and made it vertical, made it truly urban. And this is one of the departures I have with my good friends at CNU. I do believe that there are appropriate places for high-rise buildings. And I think if you're going to really depend on TOD as a strategy, then you ought to allow high-rise. Vancouver did it all correct. They did an urban growth boundary. They pretty much finished with any sites of consequence for larger subdivision expansion. And so it's all infill and it's all TOD. We're at the end of the line here, and I'll show you a project. It's 50 acres of a mall site with 10,000 units. I mean, our project in Denver for Stapleton was 4,000 acres, and we have 10,000. So you realize the orders of magnitude, the range of possibilities that are sitting in front of us. This kind of urbanism is built up there. They have different laws and their whole range of reasons why they can afford high rise and we can't, which I won't get into. But it's a simple plan. It has a lot of towers, but it always has good street walls. It has different kinds of housing types, all mixed together, and of course, some very nice open space. The HDR, my now firm, does architecture, so occasionally they'll throw in some images here. But this is the scale of the environments that are real and coming out of the ground in a place like Vancouver. This makes the idea of TOD something worth fighting for, I think. This is right at the doorstep to the train station. And this is open air pavilions in the center. Now, this is a very suburban town, Langley, but it will fill because this is the kind of housing that's economically viable for the vast majority of people that want to live there. Now, SB 50, the law in California, which didn't pass, was simplistic. It just drew circles, and God help me, I'm the one who first drew these stupid circles, and said anything within the circle could be redeveloped at various densities. Now, that meant it went crashing through sites that were thoroughly appropriate for development, but also landed on lots of stable neighborhoods and historic communities, places I don't think it was really necessary to disturb. And as a matter of fact, when we look at its impact on San Francisco, all of these darker colored sites would be open to redevelopment. So historic neighborhoods throughout the city would be demolished if this law had passed. But we were the ones who actually brought this kind of bad news to the legislators and told them, no, this is not good. I became very unpopular and people thought I was a hypocrite, but so be it. Now, I mentioned the missing middle. I think it has lots of different meanings. Obviously, when we do big master plan communities, we check every box along that spectrum, and that's a completely healthy thing. But to use that to justify going into single family neighborhoods and expecting people to redevelop their parcels without their neighbors coming at night and putting toilet paper on their yard is is a bit of a question. And at this point, we know it doesn't work. It's not a way to solve the housing crisis at scale. Remember, in California, we need on the order to be building 300,000 to 400,000 units of housing a year to begin to catch up to the deficit we've created over the last 20 years. Now, one thing I do like is we passed a law for ADU units, and the capacity is high. This is a mapping of all the single-family homes, lots in the Bay Area, and you know, you can get 75,000 units of ADUs. Right now, we're producing around 40,000. It's a very significant number of ADUs per year, and it's a really healthy thing. So I think we have to be very thoughtful and precise about how we set housing policy. We can't just be simplistic about it. So I set about trying to think of how we could actually address the problem at scale. And I started playing around with it. I actually reported to you guys the last time I was here in 2019 about this idea of converting strip commercial. And the question was, you know, exactly how much of this kind of land is there and how much housing could it produce? I mean, this is the center of Silicon Valley, some of the most valuable property in the world, and it's just asphalt and single-story buildings. It's absurd because that's all the zoning allows, and of course the NIMBYs don't want it to be anything else. And of course, it's a beautiful landscape, urban place. You want to spend a lot of time. It is where the place we ought to invest in reshaping, and this is something that Ellen has been a champion of for you know, probably longer than I have. I just basically started doing the numbers about how much was there. And also wanted to frame it as a holistic solution, that it's not just about the housing, it's about redoing the streets. This is a 120-foot right-of-way, which has room for everything you see in this picture, which is key. And, you know, making these places provide the kind of housing that ribbon and tie the region together and support stand-up transit opportunities, but also our livable environments is a great challenge, but I think it has great potential payoff. I think I reported in 19 this first little study we did for 43 miles, and we discovered that there was 250,000 units of housing potential right through the heart of Silicon Valley. El Camino, I grew up near this street, so I know it. Maybe there's a little vendetta going on with my all this. But the good news is we have now passed a law, AB 2011, which I'll go into in some depth because I think it's a good law, but it's a starting point. First, a little more background of our studies that kind of set the stage for the law. We were able to demonstrate what happens at the scale of the region if you backfill along the corridors. You can see it knits the developed areas together in ways that really need to be knitted. And it also produces a lot of housing, 1.4 million units, and with a 15% inclusionary ratio, over 300,000 units. It offers the opportunity to utilize and remake over 700 miles of, I think that the planning term is crappy roads. And of course, it's a huge solution for the environment. So going back to the old days in Sacramento, the intersection, the nexus between environmental concerns and good urbanism and good housing policy all go hand in hand. Those bars just represent the difference, the savings of an average household in red here versus the average household in the Bay Area today. And it just, you know, steps lightly and misses all the climate hazard areas. So it's always good that way. This is just to give you a feel. It's not Haussmann, it's not Paris, it's not continuous, it's not equal. It's episodic, the way American cities are and always have been. There are differences here in the zoning and the law. If you're close to transit, you get more density than if you're not. If you're on a big street, you get more density than if you're not. So here's the elements of the law. As of right zoning for all strip commercial, 0 residential. It was really important to me that we not displace any residential housing, especially the old crummy stuff. That's naturally the affordable housing. And demolishing any of that was wrong. That was a problem with SB 50. We get about 100,000 acres of infill sites statewide. And we did a market feasibility study. How much of those 10 million units that would actually be viable today to a developer who ran a pro forma? And the answer was around 2 million units. And if you do the math, that's a pretty important component of what we need to do. 15% inclusionary would, of those 2 million, this math is simple, is around 300,000 units of free, unsubsidized, low-income housing. Right now, the state has a bond, a tax stipulation that produces around 16,000 units of affordable housing per year. And we wonder why we have homelessness. It's a form-based code and it has 0 parking requirements. So those are almost afterthoughts. I know that as urbanists, we think a lot about those things, and I'll talk about them, but I mean, it was funny that there never was a question in all the debating and politics around passing the law. Nobody questioned 0 parking. Nobody questioned a form-based code. Here's the details. Rental is 15% low income. Ownership is 30% moderate. There's very little ownership in this bill, though, because we don't have condo laws that make any sense, and therefore we have very, very few condominiums in the state. Another big element, which is just one in a long list of amazing things, was that the environmental impact reports were streamlined to the point where they could not be litigated forever, and they're basically negative declarations. So all the delays and costs and basically the primary tool of NIMBYs was taken off the table. Local governments get design review based on objective standards. It's ministerial, over the counter. There's no design review board. There's no planning commission. There's no city council hearings. We get to build this stuff, and we build it as fast as we can. Wages, prevailing wage, but not union. That was the biggest political football in the whole thing. Has to be commercial, must front and arterial, can't be bigger than 20 acres. Big sites are too complicated to handle with simple form-based codes. And it's infill only, has to be surrounded by other development. And then here's the form-based standard, pretty simple. It has a minimum density of 30 because we didn't want to squander the land on high-end, low-density townhouses, which, believe me, make more money than apartment buildings. And so we kind of said, let's not allow that to happen. The height of the envelope is determined by the street scale and TOD proximity. So 4-lane, 6-lane, and TOD get you to different heights, which really gets you to different products. And the setbacks are, there's a build-to zone in the front. I don't like to build 2 lines. They're too rigid for me. And there's a step back like the old light and air thing in New York on the backside and 0 on the side. So it's a pretty simple envelope. And the beauty is it doesn't say anything about what kind of housing. So developer could do affordable housing. It could do seniors housing, could do student housing, could do, single occupant hotel rooms. It's kind of up to the place and the economics. And I think on some level, we need to let the market decide what's appropriate, just like we need to let the market decide what's appropriate in terms of parking. So you get this kind of matrix. It's not a one size fits all. It's kind of naturally varies, but always within what I consider to be the most affordable typologies, wood frames over concrete bases, in some cases live work. So here's the smallest we could do, 4 lanes, a ground floor workspace and townhouse living above, loft like this. This is a walk-up apartments that actually have a coherent street frontage and private entries, the 6-plexes and 4-plexes. This is the workhorse of apartment construction. And my good friend Dan Solomon chokes when he sees this stuff because the architecture is not good enough. But I don't know. We need the housing, and we need to be able to put people near the communities that they serve. This is an area in Redwood City that we, a long time ago, rezoned El Camino for mixed-use housing. And it was immediately built. And we haven't gotten the street enhancements, which is a whole nother topic, but we hope to. Lots of sophisticated algorithms go into these market feasibility calculations, but they're really essential. You can zone for something, but if it's not market feasible, it's not going to materialize. Just the same with SB 9 and the missing middle law. Nobody's building it. Nobody wants to live on a construction site. But here we actually ran algorithms on each parcel in the whole state for 6 different proformas producing different types of housing, and chose the one that was either the densest or the most profitable. But that's what's going to determine the new units. Now, behind all this is something kind of magical, which is the tax increment financing, which means when you redevelop the strip commercial, which is increasingly of low and zombie value because people are shopping online more, and it's not the favorite format for shopping. All of a sudden, you get a huge tax base increase, and if you take that increment, you can bond against it and get all sorts of money to spend on all the other things we think we need, like costs of services in public area, more funding for schools and affordable housing, and the transit and the bikeways and all the enhancements to the corridor itself, and more open space, which may be desirable when you add density into a community. We were able to actually get city managers to come along and support the law. Normally, cities are against infill. Certainly, the neighborhood groups are against infill. A lot of people who work in cities understand the profound need for this infill housing, and they're just happy to have the state take the blame rather than them have to argue with screaming, protesting groups. But one of the pieces of ammunition we gave them was this, which is, look, if you redevelop it, on average, you're going to get 20 times more tax base. Used to be that these guys believed that only commercial threw off enough dollars to be pay their way. But when you go to denser housing and you have this kind of tax increment, it's a windfall for cities to actually have this development happen. We looked at the bonding capacity for the 1.4 million units in the Bay Area is $34 billion. It's enough to do more than anybody could dream of doing. Now, we still have yet to pass a TIF bonding law for these corridors. So until we do that, this is actually pie in the sky. As the pie chart shows here. But the potential is there. We used to use TIF financing for redevelopment agencies. Now I think we should do them for transit corridors. Now, what about the transit? I think that once we know where the density is going to be, we can better plan the transit. And so having certainty about the continuity of this, that it's, one city may say yes and the next city says no, is gone. It's a state level mandate to have these ribbons of urbanism. So now we can rightly do the coherent kind of traffic analysis to support it and figure out what's best. This isn't what is going to be the solution for America. Very few people think that that autonomy has been on our minds this long, but it was all along. But we know that it just generates more traffic, more BMT. This is the hard rail network in the Bay Area. And look what happens if you just imagine filling out all the arterials with, at a minimum, BRT and bike lanes, which of course, turn the average walk from a quarter mile into maybe a 3-mile electric bike ride. All of a sudden you have much more access. But this makes transit so ubiquitous that perhaps it really does become a reasonable contester with the car. Right now, in most of these 6 lanes can easily afford BRT lanes. These shown here are this amazing new, what do they call it, electric trolley, autonomous trolleys coming out of China. And they actually ride and feel just like light rail. They're quite extraordinary, and they're starting to export them to Australia. But we have new technology. Once we have the right-of-way, we can put all sorts of things there. You have smaller vans. You can have direct-to-destination rides and express, and you can have enough intelligence to platoon and pass in oncoming lanes and do all sorts of exciting things. And yes, this technology is maturing. This is a system that's being put in with San Jose, connecting downtown San Jose with the airport now. So that's the vision for Grand Boulevards. And you know what? I have a whole nother speech I'm going to give now. Should I, Ellen, just tell me if you want me to stop now or keep going?
Well, Peter, let's go. Can you take like 5 more minutes?
Okay,
Can you go global for 5 more minutes?
Okay, so I'm going to skip China because it's just become a black box to us now. We don't get to play around with it, but there was a time when we were transforming these kind of super blocks into walkable mixed-use places. That little gimmick, PowerPoint gimmick, that's the same amount of roads and the same amount of development in both cases. And then we've done lots of TOD, and they are really strongly into TOD and auto-free streets. And so when I left before COVID came along, and I haven't been back to China since, they seem to be well on their way to thinking about communities in a totally different way than the past. In the low-income sprawl, which I've been more involved with since then, we've done some really interesting work for World Bank and other entities. This one in Mexico City we did some time ago. This is squatter, self-built stuff, barrio in the bottom, and then social housing above. There, you can say there's no doubt you like the owner-built stuff, but they're both in the same location, which is way out in the middle of nowhere. And they both have cities. The city of Mexico City has a just complete chaos for transit and mobility, and therein lies the dilemma. And of course, the wealthy don't care. They live downtown and they're close to everything, and right next to where all the jobs are. So when you actually map it out, 2/3 of the population live in areas where there's no walkability and no transit, and that, of course, are the poor people. We did a big master plan, and we looked at all the different trend, scenarios, and looked at across all these metrics. And of course, what really jumped out for everybody was the travel time savings for a high percentage of the lower income population. Ho Chi Minh City was another one we just completed. It's kind of an astounding look at, I think, an aggregation of all the crises that we're all going to be hitting very soon. Flooding, lack of mobility, and lack of housing. We figured out strategies for resilience and low carbon transport and affordable communities and ecological, all these things. But this is what it looks like all too often. 90% of trips in Ho Chi Minh City are on 2 wheels. And so what we discovered, jumping ahead, what we discovered was that actually just converting the 2 wheels to electric instead of 2-cycle engines, and then creating dedicated street networks that just for the bikes would be more cost effective and effective and consistent with the history and the culture of the place than metro lines. This is just showing the parts of the city that are inundated, typically below sea level in flood risk area, and also the stuff that's meant to be built out, another 560 square kilometers, is already zoned below sea level. We easily identified 2 large areas that were high ground. Remember New Orleans, there was the 9th Ward, which was flooded, and where the poor people were. And then there was the high ground, which is where the wealthy had always lived, in camp. And this is the same kind of thing all over the world. The bottom line is that they can focus their energy and their attention on building on the high ground and begin to shift the preponderance of where people are. This is back to traffic. Mixing modes, of course, creates nothing but nightmarish congestion. We did a simple calculation. It turns out that if you dedicate a whole lane of a street or a whole street, you get about a capacity of 30,000 trips per hour on that lane. It lands somewhere more capacity than light rail and less capacity than high operating BRT systems. Because of course all these buses and trains have to stop and have dwell time and basically slow the capacity and the ultimate mobility of the people on them. So it was a beautiful, elegant solution. Forget about building massive light rail and BRT systems in a hot climate. Let everybody stay on their bikes, just give them more space to do it, and then electrify it. Of course, they need drainage, they need open space. It's the only way to cope with flooding, and of course, there's a whole range of issues around heat island effect, which really wraps it all back together, which is preservation, trees, the world's simplest, best solution to just about every problem. And then this was one of the high ground areas, already partially developed, where we figured out a strategy for infill and redevelopment that I won't even begin to unpack for you, if you don't have time. So, ending with these, the principles that connect all of it, from Sacramento to Ho Chi Minh City. What are the common themes? First, we got to preserve what's there. Don't tear it down if it has historic or cultural or environmental meaning. We need growth boundaries, otherwise we will sprawl, whether you're in Ho Chi Minh or in, we need to designate where development makes sense. We do need TODs, and we need to preserve productive ag land and ecological. These are all things that I think we all know now. Mixed use. I mean, if you just span from everything I've talked about, Sacramento, Grand Boulevards, TODs, and Mexico City, mixed use is at the heart of it. Mixed use environments, mixed use workable environments. A connected street grid. It's hard if you do super blocks to get any of the other mixing to be real and useful. Shared spaces. You know, these are actually the metrics that are in the World Bank book. So they were willing to actually put numbers, targets about best practice. 80% of residential blocks located within 500 meters of neighborhood parks and civic setting some minimum best practice standards for all the things we know are essential. Sidewalks, street crossings, block perimeters dedicated to mixed use. All these things are things that you can begin to understand. They're not just qualitative. There is best practice that can identify targets. And the good news is that at least World Bank had the guts to publish it. Whether they act on it is a whole nother thing. This is where the idea, I think of Grand Boulevards as the next generation of TOD. It's a linear TOD instead of a nodal. It's based on linear mobility, whether you're on an electric bike or you're in a BRT bus that can stop much more frequently, or an autonomous vehicle that runs in a dedicated lane that can take you where you're going. It's a different urban form, but it's actually an urban form that makes the most sense when you come to infill and redevelopment. Okay, that's it.
All right.
All right.
Thank you, Peter. All right. I'm going to try. I want to again encourage. Peter and I are going to have a conversation for about 15 minutes or so, and then we want to open it up to Q&A. So please, again, use Slido if you want to post a question. That's slido.com, and the code is #2482663. But while I start this conversation, so I'm hoping, let's see, on Zoom, can you guys get this to gallery view so that hopefully we're both, we can both see each other? Anyway, I can see you. So Peter, there is so much great information in there and really condensed. I had the pleasure of going to India for the first time in May. And I went because today, 70% of urban design students in the US in graduate programs are from India. Ah. So I felt like, hey, I've got to learn something about Indian urbanism. And I went on a bit of a recruiting trip. One thing I found, which I think you probably have found in plenty of other places as well, what do you say to leaders in developing countries that argue that they need more roads, more cars to grow their middle class? And that they don't need, thank you very much, they deserve to make their own mistakes. They don't need to learn from ours. I mean, do you run into, that was very clearly an argument made to me by one of Modi's main urbanist influencers. Have you run into that kind of argument? How to build the middle class?
Everybody says that, we did it, so, they should be able to do it. Mm-hmm. God help us if we now become useful by demonstrating how it all implodes at a certain point. It certainly has imploded for the working class of this country at this point, and the homeless and so many others. So yes, I mean, the qualifier that it's something that you have to do for your middle class as opposed to for your society is perhaps the most important qualifier. What can you say? There's so much complexity in those areas. It's almost easier to focus on lower income populations that really understand how to live shared lives and with some kind of frugality and generosity to one another, as opposed to the endless desire for isolation and privatization. Mm-hmm. Let me what would I say to them? I would say, of course, cities are made for all of the above. There's there's wealthy people, there's middle-class people, there's working poor, there's working people, there's single people, and the issue isn't one size fits all, even in terms of mobility. I mean, there will be cars. There's nothing in urbanism that's ever said there shouldn't be. But in Ho Chi Minh City, where you can say that 90% of people are happily on two wheels because they can pull over and talk to a friend when they see them, trying to force them into buses may not be the best strategy. And then, living with the consequences of a growing population of automobiles displacing everybody else. So it's about balance, and in the end, I think that it's almost too complex to argue. But there's not a city that we don't design that doesn't serve all classes of people, all modes, all housing types. The tyranny of what was going on in China was that it was one housing type. I mean, there were maybe like 6 different floor plans in anyone's. That was it, and then they would do towers, and they were extruded vertically, and the physical environment. So one size fits all never works. So the answer to their question is yes, of course, but don't do it to the point where you damage the environment and everybody else.
Mhm. Well, and again, looking forward and looking ahead, and thank you for giving us your backstory of sort of where and how you began, because I think a lot of students are always are sort of wondering, I don't know where exactly my career is going to go. How do I find those opportunities? The difference for today's students is they may, in the course of their career, see the world population peak and start to decline. Certainly already we have a number, the problems of a Mexico City or a California with these booming populations are in many ways equaled by the number of places that are already shrinking and depopulating. And it's really sad to me to see how many communities that are losing population are still, they have a dead mall and they really want to make a mixed use town center. And it's like, no, you're just going to be pulling population away from your existing centers. You might attract some new people, but what advice can you give to students? Have you started thinking about, or are you aware of some good models of who's planning for shrinkage and for population, how it all settles out? What should we be planning for?
Well,
in their generation?
It's very uneven globally. Obviously, in the developing world, populations are increasing. It's only in the wealthy countries that population is stabilizing and falling. And that's a sociological, and of course the outlier, China, which did it by policy. So, in a utopian world, that's an invitation for immigration. That there are people on the planet that are in great need of being able to move, escape tyranny and violence, and move to opportunity. And by the way, that's what this country used to be all about. That's how it was founded. So, is that just sidestepping your question? Yes, the Bay Area, California is not growing anymore. It's actually losing population. It's losing jobs. Why? Because we don't have the right kind of housing in the right location. So I would say just that there needs to be, I don't want to avoid your question. There needs to be a steady state solution. The most, and I haven't studied it, but I know that Japan is probably the most advanced in this set of challenges of any country, and they're quite aware of it, and they actually see it as perhaps a fortuitous way to arrive at a different kind of homeostasis than we've ever had. Of course, Tokyo is the world's most efficient, successful city on the planet. You know, in terms of in just about every measure, it's one of the biggest and densest as well. So it just shows that you can have really intense urbanism, and it can be profoundly successful. And so, you know, as for the larger economic issues, those are very site and specific. I mean, we talk about Detroit. I tell you what scares me right now is the blue collar world imploded in this country as you know, efficiency and innovation replaced a lot of the jobs, and then of course we globalized the jobs. Their world kind of came unglued economically and then socially and culturally. But I think the same is about to happen to the white collar world once AI steps in. And so the upper middle class and those quote unquote knowledge workers are going to begin suffering in the way the blue collar work suffered, which then brings into a much bigger issue, which is if you can increase productivity without increasing labor, and you can actually generate wealth without people, or people less and less involved, or fewer and fewer people involved, you have a huge cultural and social and moral dilemma that needs to be addressed head on, one way or another. And so that's a little rambling, but it is to say that things may actually get worse before they get better in terms of the human activity and human economic wherewithal to populate and make healthy cities that are left behind. What you've done, what I'm trying to do with Grand Boulevards is to take and repair places. You know, the best ingredient to bring to force is the challenge we have, which is how can we build affordable housing for working people? And if you solve that problem, you can draw people, you can attract people.
Mm-hmm. Well, you kind of anticipated my last question, and I could have many more, but you know, the role of data, and I think your work, what you showed us a lot today that I'm assuming you're using Urban Footprint, the software you developed, and you didn't make a pitch about it at all, but we actually have a couple of classes using Urban Footprint now. My class, my studio, we had a workshop on Monday with Duncan Kay from Urban Footprint, showing us how to do the kind of scenario planning that, not at the scale quite of Grand Boulevards that you've done, but you know, in trying to learn some of those same tools. So I asked Duncan, what question about Urban Footprint should I ask Peter? And Duncan said, ask Peter what AI is going to mean for Urban Footprint and for these kinds of simulations, the world of data. Do you see AI making it easier for everyone to access all this stuff? You just call it up. Or is it just going to generate its own? I mean, ChatGPT makes up citations. Will AI simply tell us what we want to hear? And I mean, I don't know. Have you guys started having a conversation about AI and data?
Yeah. Well, I think the data stuff is it'll enhance the ease of access, but in the end, it's always about asking the right question. You know, a scenario is not. I guess we could have AI creating scenarios, but they really wouldn't have that spark of difference. There's something about AI that's always going to be backward looking, rear view mirror kind of sensibility. because it's built on, previous behavior. And it's always going to replicate and extend. How long did we new urbanists have to fight with all the market specialists who would predict the kind of places and the kinds of communities that people wanted? And those predictions were just extrapolations of prior behavior. And they didn't go to, having some vision about how things could be or should be, just extending trend lines. And so I think AI will suffer from a trend line bias for a really long time. If it breaks beyond that, it really is a form of intelligence that may be even greater than ours. And there's a metaphysical question that comes to the surface the moment that happens. There's a part of me that's incredibly optimistic about it. We need big solutions. If AI can help us get to fusion as a safe energy source, if it can help in science, in advancing science and medicine, there's no doubt that it's going to be extraordinary. But it's also going to take away jobs, no doubt about it. And this time it'll be white collar jobs instead of blue collar jobs. And everybody always thought, well, it's not going to affect me, but I think it is. And I wonder how that coincides with climate change and a world where physical resources are going to become challenged as well. So that's a very hard conundrum. And so I'm actually welcome AI as maybe something new in the mix that can provide a whole another level of solutions. So I've totally contradicted myself in this stream of consciousness. Started by saying it's dumbass trend biased, and now I'm saying it's going to invent things that we could never invent without it. And that's exactly the mystery of what it is. We don't know.
I'll do a quick poll of the audience here. How many think it's dumbass? And versus how many think that this is actually going to help the world? So how many think AI is just sort of dumbass when it comes to what it's going to do for physical planning? We have a handful of hands, not necessarily only older people. Okay. How many people think AI is going to help the world? We're definitely more people optimistic. Definitely more. All right. I'm going to Q&A now. What is your view on the idea that TOD accelerates gentrification and makes placemaking efforts become homogenous?
Well, I think at least the evolution of TOD towards Grand Boulevards shows exactly how it's not homogenous, not one size fits all. It's intrinsically different in different locations, and actually releasing the marketplace to decide what gets built where rather than zoning inherently creates diversity. Then the other, it was interesting that we had to put that qualifier in the law that nothing under 30 units an acre, because we didn't want it to become an opportunity for the wealthy to kind of continue to occupy the best locations. But, I'm not even that worried about that. Quite frankly, there's just so much of that kind of land that the market for that segment would land in Palo Alto and Atherton, probably the two wealthiest places in Silicon Valley. And then, you get to the East Bay, you get to San Pablo Avenue and these kinds of places. And what you're doing is the heavy lifting of lower income housing needs, which is a good thing. So no, I don't think it homogenizes at all. I particularly like the fact that you have these ribbons of lower income, more affordable, and maybe singles and empty nesters and, different demographics running through communities that get to be pretty homogenous in their housing type. And so they are agents of diversity and change rather than reinforcing it. It's just the opposite.
So what, do you have any success stories or essentially tips on how to navigate the NIMBY power dynamics? You've had 50 years of dealing with the NIMBYs. What have you learned? What works better or not?
State law.
What's that?
It's state law. You cannot solve NIMBYism at its own scale. You can't solve it city by city. Einstein said something like that. But, you can't solve it at its own.
Well, and it is true. And that gets really to another one of my questions. There has been pushback that in some ways by having state law overriding the local communities laws, I mean, is this overreach? Is this also leading to homogenization of ways that, and I mean, how have you been defending? I'm sure you've been getting some of that pushback.
I was surprised, and maybe it's because I just travel in blue states.
Hello, we're in Georgia.
People are interested in this, and there doesn't seem to be that much pushback. I got as much pushback from the environmental groups and the affordability advocates on this law as I did from, people who said, don't screw with my neighborhood. So I haven't really experienced that as much anymore. And we're now starting to do some Grand Boulevard studies in Ohio. So in those places, there's always there is rationality. I mean, it's hard to find. You think it's no longer there, but it is there. There are rational business people that basically say, yes, we need to build housing for our workforce. We can't have our businesses here if we don't have that. It's just simple. And so you'll get these Chamber of Commerce groups that'll say, yes. The problem has always been the planning process leads to city council hearings where a few people can stand up and shout and intimidate. But it's not, and that's why taking it to the state level gets it clean of those kinds of simplistic emotions and turns it into something where people actually look at the rational dimension of it. But I was surprised to see the environmentalists not want. The environmentalists were anxious because EIRs were going to be sterilized, but only for these existing developed parcels. I just couldn't understand how obsessed they were, about doing an EIR, replacing some strip commercial site with some housing. I mean, the environmental impacts are positive. Anyway, we also passed a law in California that actually said we could no longer calculate traffic impact by service level at local intersections. It had to be analyzed based on VMT per household. So if the household that were being built would reduce VMT, then
vehicle miles traveled, yes, VMT.
So that was a big, it's so funny how these obscure little knobs in the process that you can turn and get consequence. Anyway, no, I don't think, I've forgotten the question. The politics are really squirrely. I'll just ramble here for a minute. The biggest opposition was from the trade unions, because they wanted 100% of everything built to be unionized, even though the trade unions are spread so thin in California that they wouldn't be able to bid on it all themselves. Politically, we split off the carpenters union, which was maybe 10-1 compared to the trades in terms of population. And they said, yes, please, we want a lot of construction to happen, and we're willing to take it at prevailing wage. As opposed to the union guys who want to have exclusive rights to anything that gets constructed. So that was a bigger battle than with any other group.
Lots and lots of questions. We're not going to get to them. We really are just about at our end here. But a number of them are really still focusing on the corridors. So I'm going to combine here a little bit. One question is, what are some successful examples of densified corridors in North America? And Rockville Pike in Montgomery, Maryland is one I'm tracking, which I think is really doing extremely well. And what you might have some to add. And another on the corridors is asking, are prescribed densities for boulevards enough to justify numbers for BRT as a minimum? And more, the corridors don't create critical mass for mixed use hubs the way the TODs do.
Yeah.
Kind of,
Look, ask me 3 questions. I'm going to forget 2 of them. Come on, please. What was the first part of the question?
Well, all right. Any good examples of corridors that have densified?
I think you've been at this a long time, so have I. I think 15 years ago, I rezoned University Avenue, which is the gateway to Berkeley and the campus, for mixed use. And it's built out, and it went from being the highest crime rates in the city to kind of normative now. So that's one metric that seemed to have worked out, but clearly it's a more interesting street than it used to be. I showed you some slides from Redwood City on El Camino, where, and actually Mountain View also did zoning for it. It's just, there's a lot of it going on. Interestingly enough, enlightened cities who actually want to address the housing crisis tend to end up at that conclusion.
Yeah, there's a lot of it going on. I can't keep track of all of the corridors that at least they've done the rezoning. How much of them have really built out is another question.
Third question.
And the road diets. The road diets are really essential, I think, too.
The third part of the question is, does it justify enough? Is it dense enough to justify transit? And
yeah.
I've given up on light rail. Built everything around that concept because it's too expensive now. I mean, we're talking about $150 million a mile, or just absurd numbers. But the cost of BRT is just not that high. And there are many different variations on BRT. And I also believe that bike lanes are going to become more and more significant components of mobility. So not all densities, not all urban form needs to be focused on traditional rail transit. You could have a great 4-lane boulevard with 3- and 4-story development along it and electric bikeways, and all of a sudden I think you'd have a pretty robust 80% solution.
All right. I think with that, I would like to invite Tom Walsh to come to this stage. So Tom came in just a little bit late, but and then we'll just invite Tom to say a few words, whatever you'd like, Tom, and then we're going to go upstairs for a reception, and we're going to let Peter wish he was joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry I was late. I live in the suburbs now, and I don't have a time frame of how to navigate the roads in Atlanta. Peter and I had you and I had contact. We had lunch together, and we were going after a project, or we won a project. I just can't remember what it was. So we're both in that same man, forgetting my history. But I will say the one most important thing, when I started in the new urbanism world, I had been practicing landscape architecture for over 15 years. And when I turned 40, I was really looking for a different direction. And it just happened, a project in Memphis, Tennessee called Mud Island. Henry Turley was developing it. And he hired me to go to Savannah and to Charleston to measure. And I wasn't quite sure why he wanted me to do that, but that was pretty exciting to get to go to those 2 cities. And that was the first time I heard about neo-traditional planning. And so I said, okay, I've got to read about this. And the first book that I bought was Peter's book, and I have it in my pack, and it's frayed with many, many notes. And it was my textbook for learning how to start new urbanism. If I had a question, I'd go look at all the graphics that were in there. So Peter was and Andreas and Folizordes were the thinkers that helped the people that really started practicing this, really help us understand and motivated us to move forward in this practice. So I'm certainly grateful for that book and the other books that Peter's written. So TSW is happy to do this. This is, I think, the fourth one. Fourth one. So we have one more to go, but we've certainly enjoyed doing this over the years. And sorry I was late.
You're forgiven. You're forgiven. All right. Well, with that, I really just sincerely, if you want those AIA credits, you have to sign on your way out, sign the sheet. And other than that, I just say thank you, Peter, for stretching our minds and all those good things.
You know, I think this may have to be the last time because I'm starting to repeat myself too much, even for my own taste. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Peter.